I'm Rick Harrison, and this is my pawn shop.
Rick Harrison made his fortune by never paying more than something was worth. And for 30 years, that skill kept him rich, famous, and untouchable. By 2019, the man behind the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas had built one of the most recognized brands in American television, a net worth that estimates placed at $20 million, and a real estate portfolio spread across at least 7 commercial properties. What came next cost him most of it, and the way it happened tells you more about wealth, debt, and the price of celebrity than any business school case study could manage. Growing up in San Diego with epilepsy that first appeared when he was 8 years old, Rick Harrison didn't have the kind of childhood that produces future television personalities. Seizures interrupted his schooling, limited his options, and forced him to think differently about how he'd earn a living. That differently turned out to mean studying value, learning history, understanding what objects were worth and why. And by the time he was 13, he was already working deals. When his early 20s arrived, he borrowed money to go into business with his father, Richard Harrison, a retired Navy man who would eventually become famous under the nickname the Old Man. Together they opened the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop in 1989, off the Las Vegas Strip, in a city built entirely on the idea that risk is just opportunity wearing a different jacket. Pawn shops don't forgive ignorance, and Rick learned that fast. The business model strips out every illusion, because the moment you pay too much for an item you can't resell, the loss is yours, and nobody else's. Rick responded by turning himself into a walking encyclopedia of American history, antiques, and collectibles, the kind of knowledge base that takes decades to build and can't be faked behind a camera or a counter. For 20 years, he ran the shop, built its reputation, and stayed mostly outside the spotlight. That changed when the History Channel came to him in 2009 with an offer to film the daily operations of the store. Pawn Stars premiered on July 19, 2009. And became something nobody predicted, not even Rick. At its peak, the reality television show drew 5.7 million viewers per episode, outpacing most primetime dramas and turning a Las Vegas pawn shop into one of the most visited tourist destinations in the entire United States. 4,000 people walked through the shop's doors every single day. Personal appearance fees climbed to $80,000 per event. Rick wrote an autobiography called License to Pawn that became a bestseller, launched a shopping complex called Pawn Plaza adjacent to the store, produced a spin-off series called Rick's Rules, and expanded into restaurant ventures layered on top of all of it. By 2014, conservative estimates of his net worth landed around $9 million, though the real number, factoring in business valuation and real estate holdings, ran considerably higher. Entertainment had turned a pawnbroker into a brand, and the brand kept generating money from every direction at once. The first crack appeared in June 2018, when Richard Harrison, the Old Man, passed away. For viewers, losing the patriarch changed the show's dynamic in ways that ratings would eventually confirm. For Rick, it meant losing the co-founder of everything he'd built, the business partner who'd been there from the beginning, and the anchor that had steadied the operation through 30 years of Las Vegas volatility. His son Corey, known on television as Big Hoss, had been groomed to take over the family business eventually. But the relationship between father and son grew complicated in the years that followed. Corey wanted aggressive expansion and modernization. Rick wanted to stay with what had already worked. Neither position was unreasonable, but the disagreement pulled in 2 directions at once. And family businesses don't handle that tension quietly or cheaply. Then Rick's third marriage to Deanna Burdett ended in divorce in 2020. Nevada operates as a community property state, which meant everything acquired during the marriage divided 50-50, and court documents showed the settlement cost Rick an estimated $4 million in cash, property, and other assets. The timing couldn't have been worse, because 2020 also brought COVID-19, and Las Vegas absorbed that blow harder than almost any other city in America. The tourist foot traffic that had been feeding the gold and silver pawn shop's 4,000 daily visitors dropped to nearly zero almost overnight. The show went on hiatus. Personal appearances canceled across the board. Restaurant ventures that had already been operating on thin margins found themselves with no customers and no relief in sight. What most people missed about that period was the specific way pawn shops get hurt during economic downturns. When times get hard, more people need loans, which means more items coming in as collateral, which means more inventory sitting on shelves while the cash side of the operation runs short. Rick was holding millions in pawned merchandise, while the liquid part of the business dried up completely. Pawn Plaza, the shopping complex he'd invested in so heavily, watched its tenants close one by one as foot traffic disappeared. The revenue streams that had looked diversified on paper all tied back to the same underlying source, which was Las Vegas tourism. And when that source stopped flowing, every stream ran dry at the same time. Estimates put the gold and silver pawn shop's revenue losses at over $2 million in 2020 alone, against an overhead that included insurance, security, staff, and the monthly carrying costs on the Pawn Plaza properties that didn't pause because a pandemic had arrived. The legal problems started landing in 2021. A former employee filed a lawsuit citing wrongful termination and hostile work environment issues at the shop. And while the case settled out of court, legal fees and settlement costs reportedly exceeded $500,000. A separate dispute with a former business partner, tied to a failed restaurant venture, produced a claim that Rick owed over $1 million, and that case dragged through Nevada courts for more than a year, burning through legal fees on both sides without producing anything except expenses. When you expand as aggressively as Rick had during the good years, you accumulate business relationships, and those relationships get tested hard when the money stops coming in as expected. None of that would have been fatal on its own, but the real estate picture was where the deeper damage accumulated. During the years when the television money and pawn shop income flowed freely, Rick had invested heavily in Las Vegas commercial property, residential units, and land holdings, using debt to finance the purchases rather than cash. On paper, the strategy made sense in a city where property values were climbing steadily, and the expansion of a celebrity brand seemed to justify an aggressive posture. The problem was that those mortgages carried monthly payment obligations that didn't pause when revenue dropped. Conservative estimates put Rick's total mortgage obligations across his portfolio at over $15 million by the time the pandemic arrived. When rental income collapsed and property values stagnated, he found himself servicing debt on assets that weren't generating the returns he'd counted on to cover them. By 2021, sources familiar with the situation reported that Rick had begun quietly selling properties at significant losses just to reduce the debt burden. One commercial building purchased for $2.8 million in 2016 sold for $1.9 million in 2021, a loss of $900,000 on a single transaction, before accounting for the improvements and carrying costs spent during those 5 years. Pawnstars itself was declining at the same time, which cut the one revenue stream that had been both reliable and high margin. The 5.7 million viewer peak had eroded steadily year after year, and by 2020, episodes averaged around 1.2 million viewers, still respectable for cable television, but nowhere near the cultural phenomenon that had justified the show's commercial value and the personal appearance fees it generated off-screen. The death of the old man had removed something from the on-screen chemistry that no casting decision could replace. Behind-the-scenes stories began circulating on social media, claiming that transactions had been staged, that customers were actors, and that items had been sourced specifically for filming rather than brought in organically. Reality television has always operated in the gray space between documentary and drama, but the authenticity of the gold and silver pawn shop had been the show's primary appeal, and once that authenticity came under sustained public questioning, The damage to the brand compounded faster than ratings data alone could capture. The History Channel began ordering fewer new episodes, and fewer episodes meant less income from the most consistent revenue stream Rick had built over 15 years. By mid-2023, analysts who examined the situation estimated Rick's net worth had dropped from its peak of around $20 million to somewhere below $3 million in liquid assets, with ongoing debt obligations potentially pushing the effective number into negative territory. Reports emerged that Rick had taken out substantial loans against the gold and silver pawn shop itself, using the business that started everything as collateral to manage the debt load created by everything else. The shop that had survived the 2008 financial crisis, that had welcomed millions of tourists, that had turned a Las Vegas pawnbroker into one of the most recognized faces in American entertainment, had become the last chip pushed across the table. What followed was a genuine attempt to reverse the damage. Rick restructured the pawn shop's operations and cut overhead costs, reducing staff and adjusting hours to bring the business back to its core function of lending money against valuable items. He increased personal appearances wherever he could still command fees, launched a podcast called The Rick Harrison Show to capitalize on his name recognition in new media, pushed the television production toward celebrity guest appearances and higher-value items, and began offering consulting work to other pawn shop owners and business owners who recognized his expertise. The effort was real, and the determination was visible, and by 2024, reports suggested his net worth had stabilized somewhere around $5 million, though the remaining debt obligations kept his financial position far more fragile than any number in the millions might suggest to a casual observer. The distance between $20 million and $5 million, covered in roughly 4 years, came from sources that each looked manageable in isolation, but became overwhelming when they arrived together. A $4 million divorce settlement, more than $2 million in business losses during the pandemic, over $1 million in legal fees and settlements, more than $2 million in documented real estate losses, and declining television income that shrank every remaining revenue stream simultaneously and without warning. No single event caused it. The collapse came the way most financial collapses come, which is gradually and then very quickly, each pressure point weakening the structure until the whole thing shifted at once. Rick Harrison spent decades developing the ability to identify value in other people's possessions, to look at a Civil War musket or a vintage pinball machine or a signed Beatles album and tell you within minutes what it was worth and why. That skill built 35 years of work into something that employed his family, attracted millions of tourists to Las Vegas, and made him one of the most recognizable faces in American cable television history. Somewhere in the expansion years, the same discipline that built the empire stopped being applied to the empire itself. The real estate deals looked rational until they didn't. The diversification looked like protection until every diversified stream hit the same wall at the same moment. The television money looked permanent until the viewers moved on. The gold and silver pawn shop is still open. Rick Harrison still walks through its doors. Pawn Stars still airs new episodes on the History Channel. At 58 years old, Rick has both the experience and the motivation to negotiate a different outcome than the one the numbers currently describe. Whether he manages it depends on factors no camera has ever captured. What the last 5 years revealed, though, is something worth holding on to. A man who understood value better than almost anyone, and discovered that understanding it and actually holding on to it are two entirely different skills that don't always come in the same package.